The Ultra Greatswords or the Colossal Swords tend to be the largest weapons in the entire series, and they're honestly amazing in every single game, as it can just output ridiculous damage and really good poise damage, while honestly not even being that slow as well. But for today, we are going to go over the top 30 best Ultra Greatswords in the entire series. I'm not going to rank every single one of them because there are a lot in total, and typically I just do a top 25, but there are so many good Ultra Greatswords, and there was a bunch that just needed to be on the list that I have to talk about, so I'm making it a top 30. And once again, it is a PvE only list, and it's based on how well the weapons perform inside of their own game. But to get into it, and starting off at number 30, we have the Profaned Greatsword from Dark Souls 3, which is a pure physical damaging and quality-based Ultra Greatsword. In terms of damage, it's not going to really outdamage a lot of the infusible-based Ultra Greatswords. And compared to things like the Black Knight Greatsword, it's also not going to get as much damage with a quality build either. But it does have a few things going for it, and that's one is going to be its moveset, because this is the best Ultra Greatsword moveset that you can get, in my opinion. The horizontal swiping light attacks and the heavy attack poke. It means you just get access to nice wide horizontal swings, which is perfect to deal with all the ganks in this game. And the poking heavy attack is just incredible, because poking attacks will typically maximize the range of the weapon. They'll probably have faster animations, and most importantly, they're doing thrusting damage, which being able to have another damage type alongside your weapon is always going to be really good, and thrusting damage is the best damage type. And when paired alongside things like the Leer Ring, you can just get amazing damage. And specifically with the Profaned Greatsword, it does get a unique heavy attack that adds like a little bit of fire damage on top. And in terms of its weapon art in Profaned Flame, it is like a reskinned version of the Stomp skill. It just does like a little bit of a fire-based AoE and just buffs the weapon with 80 fire damage. But I think the best part about the weapon is going to be that it's really light and it has low requirements while not really sacrificing that much in terms of damage. There are going to be other weapons that actually get the same moveset as this one that can just get more damage, namely things like the LOTHRIC Knight Greatsword or the LORIAN'S Greatsword. That works very similar to this weapon, but it typically perform better at higher levels due to its intelligence and faith-based scaling. But being that you can get this one earlier in the game and that it does pure physical damage, it is going to be a perfectly fine option, and it's never going to be bad at all. Number 29, the Black Knight Greatsword in Dark Souls 1. Now, when it comes to the Black Knight weapons in this game, they're all incredibly powerful. They always offer amazing damage, really high poise damage. They upgrade with Twinkling Titanites, which is like the easiest upgrade path in the entire game. Now, the trade-off is that the Black Knight weapons can only really be acquired at the end of the game unless you get lucky, because the Black Knights throughout the rest of the game do not respawn and they're not guaranteed to drop the weapon. But any single time that you do manage to get one to drop, honestly, I would just go with it. Now, the reason why the Black Knight Greatsword is not going to get much higher is because compared to things like the Black Knight Sword or the Black Knight Halberd, this one doesn't really get high base damage like those weapons, which I think is typically the best thing about the Black Knight weapons. You don't really have to spec into much of your damaging stats. You just have to level up the weapon, which is very easy to do, and just maximize your damage output. But the thing is, with the Black Knight Ultra Greatsword, it gets relatively low base damage. Like, it literally gets just as much as the Greatsword variant, but the trade-off being is that it gets better scalings. And the thing is, once you end up going to higher levels, there are going to be other Ultra Greatswords that just end up doing more damage than this one, while also having a faster moveset as well. Which, speaking of the moveset, the heavy attacks are pretty cool. The one-handed is a nice poke, but it is like a lot slower than like the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword poking attack, and really not going to do as much damage either. But the two-handed heavy attack can like send enemies flying into the air. And also, just like all the other Black Knight weapons, it does do 20% more damage to demons. So it is a very solid weapon overall, but compared to some of the other Black Knight weapons in the game and some of the other Ultra Greatswords, it still is lacking a little bit. Number 28, we have the Dark Souls 3 Greatsword, or the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, whatever you want to call it. This is an infusible Greatsword that actually does get some of the most range and actually the most damage out of all the other infusible options. And infusible weapons in Dark Souls 3 tend to just be the best weapons because not only can you get amazing damage, but you can also buff them as well. And on top of all that, you actually can get the weapon pretty early on. It is pretty heavy, but it's not that much heavier than some of the other options. But the main reason why it's not going to get higher onto the list is because of its moveset. One, it gets the vertical moveset, which I'm just not going to like as much as the horizontal moveset, because in Dark Souls 3, there are lots of ganks, and you want to be able to have a moveset that can just hit more enemies at once, and the horizontal moveset just does it better, while also being a bit faster, and actually consuming less stamina. So I just don't really like the vertical moveset much, unless you do have like an enemy standing behind you, because it actually does have a backwards hitbox, which is pretty cool. But the best heavy attack that the Ultra Greatswords tend to get will be the poking heavy attack. And unfortunately, the Greatsword gets a horizontal swipe, which actually does complement the vertical swipes really nicely. But losing out on having a poking attack with this weapon is going to be a major downside, because a lot of damage can come out of this poking heavy attack. And I think the worst part about all of this is that its skill is a stomp sideward swipe. which is basically the same thing as its heavy attack, and funnily enough, it literally does less damage. So you kind of almost have a useless skill unless you are in a situation to where you do want to tank attacks, because Stomp does give you a bunch of hyper armor. Like if this thing had a poking attack heavy, I would easily put it in like the top 15. Number 27, we have the Demon Souls Greatsword, which yes, the Greatsword and Demon Souls didn't look like the Guts' sword like we do have nowadays. And it kind of looks more like the ZWEIHANDER, because yeah, there's no ZWEIHANDER in this game. And also, they weren't called Ultra Greatswords back then, they were called Very Large Swords. And this is one of two very large swords in this game. This one just being the lighter variant that just gets less damage too. And I would like to say that you actually get this one earlier in the game too, but unfortunately, you don't. You actually can get the Dragon Bone Smasher first. And then we can get a lot more damage while having the exact same moveset, only having a slightly bit higher requirement, but it does weigh 10 units more, which I guess is like the main reason why this still actually makes it to the list, and that you can still get respectable damage while only actually weighing 10 units. And also, this one actually can be infused. So if you actually did want to use a very large sword with a faith-based build, you actually could do that with a Greatsword, where you otherwise could not with a Dragon Bone Smasher. But if you were to go with a strength-based build, I would honestly just go with a Dragon Bone Smasher instead, because it just does more damage. Number 26, the Cathedral Knight Sword in Dark Souls 3, which you can get relatively earlier on if you do farm for it. Now, in terms of its damage, it's not going to really be that high. It's not going to get anywhere near as much as the Guts' Greatsword, and it does get a very similar moveset, as it actually does share the exact same vertical light attack combo. And just like the Guts' Greatsword, it also gets the horizontal swiping stomp skill, but unlike the Guts' Greatsword, it actually gets a heavy attack poke, which I'm going to prefer much more. And if you wanted to use the vertical swiping moveset and use an infusible Greatsword, this will just be the one that I use purely for this reason. Unfortunately, it does get the worst range compared to all the other Ultra Greatswords with this moveset, but you can get respectable damage, not have it weigh that much. But the main reasons why it's not going to get much higher is because, once again, I don't really care much for this light attack combo, and there are other weapons that can just end up doing more damage than this one too. Number 25, the MALIKETH'S Black Blade from Elden Ring, which is a very high damaging strength faith-based weapon that does get some split holy damage. Now, being a high damaging holy weapon doesn't really mean much specifically for the base game with how many enemies there are resist to holy damage, but thankfully in the DLC, it is going to perform better, but it's probably not when it comes to its skill, because its skill is Destined Death, which for 40 FP does do this like short range AoE attack that can just melt a whole bunch of enemies, because it does do this Destined Death damage over time effect, which is percentage damage. And with how many times that it does hit against bosses with really large amounts of health, it can just straight up destroy them. Now, unfortunately, this Destined Death damage over time effect was actually nerfed specifically for the DLC location to where it's like half as effective. So against these bosses with really large HP in the DLC, it's not going to really do as well. And combined with the fact that it does consume 40 FP and have a long animation for a close range attack means that it's extremely risky, and using it against some of these DLC bosses is basically just a death sentence. But the fact that it is a really high damaging Colossal sword that can get a high damaging skill, and it can be one of the better options specifically like in later New Game Plus iterations, is still enough reason for it to be in the top 30. Number 24, the Black Knight Greatsword in Dark Souls 3, which this weapon cannot be infused, and unfortunately, if you cannot be infused in Dark Souls 3, that's automatically a downside, because it is missing out on a lot more damage by not being able to get buffed. But thankfully, the Black Knight Ultra Greatsword does get really high damage. Specifically with a quality build, it actually can get the highest amount of damage if you don't account for the other weapons using buffs. And just like all the other Black Knight weapons, it actually does do 20% more damage to demons, which is not many demons in this game, so it's not really that big of a positive. It also does get the vertical moveset, which, as I mentioned, don't really care for as much. But in terms of its heavy attack, it does share the exact same one in Dark Souls 1, and that the one-handed heavy is going to be a poking attack, which is not going to get as much damage as like the two-handed poking attacks that the other Ultra Great Swords get, but the fact that you still can get access to thrusting damage is really good. And as for the two-handed heavy attack, it does do that same nice upward cut that sends enemies flying into the air, which is fantastic, because typically you can only really do that with a weapon art, and also it just gets the most amount of poise damage out of a heavy attack compared to all the other Ultra Great Sword heavies. But I think the coolest thing about the heavy attack is that the initial downward slam does have a hitbox, so if you actually face away from the enemy and use the heavy attack, it'll actually hit them initially, and you can go ahead and track back towards the enemy and hit them with the follow-up attack. It means you're not only going to do more damage and more poise damage, but you're also going to stagger enemies easier. The only downside is that it can be a bit harder to pull off. It means that you do have to play locked off as well. And this hitbox doesn't really have much range, but when you do pull it off, it does feel very powerful, and you will be noticing that really high poise damage. Number 23, the DRAKEKEEPE'S Ultra Greatsword in Dark Souls 2. And I kind of do want to give a shout out to the ZWEIHANDER as well. There are lots of instances when it comes to the weapons in Dark Souls 2, to where like there's a weapon that's just outclassed by something else, but one's earlier in the game and the other one is later, and that's true in this instance. The Drakekeeper's Ultra Greatsword gets the exact same moveset as the ZWEIHANDER, also just doing pure physical damage, can be buffed and infused, but the Drakekeeper's Ultra Greatsword, you just get it later in the game, it's a bit heavier, and it has a bit higher of a requirement. Now, the main reason why it makes it to the list is because it gets the best movesets. The horizontal swiping light attacks, which is what I love. It's good at hitting multiple enemies, and with how bad the tracking is in Dark Souls 2, the horizontal swipe is much better to have. And it gets the poking heavy attack, which a lot of Ultra Greatswords do get a poking heavy attack, and actually can get more damage than this one with their poking heavy, but those weapons will actually have projectile heavy attacks. Things like the Drakewing Ultra Greatsword, the Ivory King Greatsword, or the Smelter Sword, they all get the poking heavy attack, but they just also get an added AoE or projectile that makes them do more damage. But the thing is, those heavy attacks actually do have a slightly slower animation and consume a lot of durability. So if you actually did want to have the traditional poking attack heavy with a nice horizontal swiping light attack combos, the Drakekeeper's Ultra Greatsword is just the best option. It's just not going to get higher on the list because a lot of other Ultra Greatswords can just outdamage it. Number 22, the Dark Souls 1 Demon Great Machete, which this is one of 3 infusible Ultra Greatswords in this game. The other ones being the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword and the ZWEIHANDER, and this one can literally get more damage than both of those things while having very similar range, but unfortunately it does have much higher requirements, does weigh a decent amount more, and have a slightly slower light attack combo. It's not really that noticeable, but it still is a bit slower. But the thing is, it actually can get a decent chunk more damage than those weapons. And when it comes to things like the rolling attack or the jumping attacks being the exact same speeds, there can be instances to where the Demon Great Machete is going to be better to have than even things like the ZWEIHANDER. But unfortunately for the Demon's Great Machete, it gets a horrible heavy attack, as it does get this really slow downward slamming attack that has like the longest animation of all time. Now, it does do a lot of poise damage, but another weapon that gets a downward slam heavy attack that also does a lot of poise damage is the ZWEIHANDER, and that one just covers more range and does it like twice as fast. And being that that weapon weighs a lot less, has much lower requirements, and has a faster light attack combo, I'm just gonna prefer that one more. But the fact that this one can be the hardest hitting Ultra Greatsword in the entire game is still enough reason for it to be on the list. Number 21, the LORIAN'S Greatsword. Now, as I mentioned earlier with the Profaned Greatsword, this one is very similar. Like, its weight, moveset, requirements, they're basically the exact same. Even the weapon art, both versions actually do like some reskinned version of a stomp upward cut, and both result in actually doing a fire-based AoE, and both actually giving you a plus 80 fire buff when using the skill too. Now, the slight differences are that the LORIAN'S Greatsword actually does get buffed when you just use the first part of the weapon art, whereas the Profaned Greatsword, you can only buff it when you use the entire combo. And the LORIAN'S Greatsword actually does come with split fire damage, whereas the Profaned Greatsword is just pure physical. And the LORIAN'S actually does come with an intelligence and faith-based scaling. So therefore, if you actually wanted to build around some pyromancies, this one is just going to be the better option. And if you're at higher levels, I'm just going to prefer this one more. Now, with its split fire damage, throughout like the majority of regular new game, the Profaned Greatsword can just outdamage it, and you can get that one a bit earlier in the game. I kind of wish that some of these boss weapons actually had some unique types of skills, and not just reskinned ones, especially because of the LOTHRIC Knight Greatsword gets the exact same moveset as both of these things, while also getting a very similar skill, but that one can just get more damage, and probably better for like a dexterity build, where these ones are kind of more for quality, and then LORIAN'S Greatsword instance is good for int faith builds too. So a lot of weapons in Dark Souls 3 tend to be very similar, but every single one of these options have like one thing going for them that makes them like not completely outclassed. Number 20, the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, which is a quality-based colossal sword in this game that does get somewhat of a faith scaling as well. And yes, this thing literally scales better off strength and dexterity than it does with faith. This is not a faith on dexterity-based weapon as it is advertised. Now, the weapon itself doesn't really weigh too much, doesn't have like the highest amount of requirements, and it does get the best light attack combo out of all the colossal swords because it literally just is faster, and it does these nice diagonal swipes, which is really good for hit detection. Now, unfortunately for the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, there's going to be like another weapon that gets the exact same light attack, but just a better heavy attack, and that's a weapon that can be infused in the Fire Knight Greatsword. So that one is just going to eventually directly outclass it, but the fact that you get this one in the base game, and that it does have a unique skill, still makes it deserving to be in the top 20. Because the Queen of Black Flame skill is extremely high damaging. It is like a close range AoE type of attack that does like amazing damage. You get really good hyper armor, and it does do this Black Flame damage over time effect, which against enemies with really large amounts of health, it is just going to melt and destroy them. Now, unfortunately, just as I mentioned with the MALIKETH'S Black Blade, this effect is actually nerfed specifically for the DLC, to where it's actually half as effective. And in fact, for some bosses like Bale, it's actually a third as effective. So it definitely is one of the best base game colossal swords, but unfortunately, once you get to the DLC, there really isn't going to be much more of a use for it. Number 19, the Lost Sinner's Sword in Dark Souls 2. Now this is kind of a quality-based greatsword. Honestly, the scalings kind of just suck, and it's to the point that if you just go into like a lot of strength or dexterity, most other ultra greatswords are going to outdamage it. But the thing is with this weapon, it gets really high base damage, and with a raw infusion, it gets ridiculously high base damage. And it's to the point that it literally outdamages every single ultra greatsword in the entire game with this particular infusion, except for the King's ultra greatsword. Like yes, it can even outdamage the FUME ultra greatsword and the GODSLAYER'S greatsword, and the fact that it has a much lower requirement while also weighing the least makes it be one of the best ultra greatswords, because you don't have to worry about speccing into strength or dexterity. You can just go all into health, endurance, adaptability, while still benefiting off amazing damage. Now, unfortunately, the downsides for the Lost Sinner's Sword is that one, if you have killed NPCs throughout your playthrough, that means you have sinned, and if you sinned, this weapon does do less damage. Also, the weapon does get the worst amount of range in class, but in return, it does consume the least amount of stamina. But I think worst of all yet, it gets a moveset that I just do not like at all. When it comes to the ultra greatswords in Dark Souls 2, they can be very frustrating to use, especially these vertical swiping types, because the tracking is so bad in this game, and having a vertical moveset means that there's so many times where you just miss your attack. But it's not even just a light attack that I don't like. The heavy attack has a really bad lunge. The running attack gets a stupidly long recovery animation. Like in most instances, if I actually am building around the ultra greatsword, I would want to try and go into like a power stancing type of build, so you actually can benefit off the nice horizontal swipes, and probably even get a nice poking attack heavy too. So for something like the Lost Sinner's Sword, it might be beneficial to pop a bonfire aesthetic to get a second one, although leveling up 2 boss weapons in one playthrough can be a pain in the ass. Number 18, we have the STARSCOURGE Greatsword from Elden Ring, which this is a paired Colossal Sword, meaning that when you two-hand it, it does give you the power stancing combo, which is beneficial for multiple reasons. Power stancing combos will typically just always end up resulting in higher DPS, but they tend to have the trade-off in poise damage, higher stamina cost, and also just having to level up multiple different weapons and having to bear the weight of these 2 weapons. But in this instance, you only have to level up 1, and it's just going to have the weight of 1 as well. Now, unfortunately, the stance damage is still going to be really bad. For some reason, you do less stance damage if you use the power stancing combos or the dual wielding combos compared to if you just use them one-handed, which I don't know why that's the case. The weapon also does get some of the worst range in class too, but thankfully, it does actually get some pretty respectable damage with its really good strength scaling and somewhat small of an intelligence scaling. But the best part about the weapon is going to be its skill and Starcaller Cry, which for 20 FP does do this big gravity AoE attack. Doesn't do much damage, but it does like suck these smaller enemies in towards you. And the follow-up AoE attack does monstrous amounts of damage. I think it hits really hard. Does scale purely off your AR, so just going all into strength is going to be best. And against a whole bunch of trash mobs, if you're just grouped up by a bunch of enemies, this thing can just utterly decimate them. Even if they are slightly larger, you do get a lot of hyper armor to actually help tank the attack. It might not be the best thing to use against enemies that are super tanky and don't give you long openings. It might be pretty risky to use. But in that instance, you can still benefit of using like the really high damaging light attacks. Number 17, the DRAKEWING Ultra Greatsword, which this weapon does get the exact same moveset as the ZWEIHANDER and the horizontal swiping light attacks and the poking heavy attack. Now, as I mentioned, the DRAKEKEEPER'S Ultra Greatsword is just going to perform better in terms of damage while getting the exact same moveset and actually a slightly faster heavy attack. But the DRAKEWING Ultra Greatsword does actually have its heavy attack turn into a projectile as well. And this projectile goes insanely far. Like out of all the projectile heavy attacks in this game, I'm pretty sure this one just goes the furthest. Now, the damage itself is not going to be amazing. It does like roughly like light attack worth of damage at this further distance, and just like all projectile heavy attacks, they consume a lot of durability. But thankfully, at the point at which you get this in the game, you can very well get the bracing knuckle ring +2 and cut the durability cost in half. But if you're going from bonfire to bonfire, more likely than not, you're going to have to stack up on repair powders or the repair spell. But the main reason why it's going to get this high is because when you use this thing at point blank range, it has a hitbox for both the weapon and the projectile attack, and it actually also does extend to the follow-up heavy attack too, so it's not just for the first one. So the entire combo, which will probably end up draining your entire stamina bar, is definitely going to be worth it because you're just going to be doing so much damage. Like the only downsides that I can say about this weapon is that one, the AR of this weapon is not going to be high. A lot of other ultra great swords will just out damage this thing, and obviously the heavy attack does consume a lot of durability and can sometimes be inconsistent at these closer ranges. Like there'll be times where you just like miss with the AoE but hit with the weapon, but it doesn't change the fact that it's an extremely powerful weapon. Number 16, the Ruins Greatsword from Elden Ring. This is another strength and intelligence-based weapon, and kind of like for all gravity-based weapons, it's pretty much just pure strength. You don't really go into the intelligence stat at all until you've hit like 80 strength. But this does get the traditional Colossal Sword moveset, actually does get some striking damage. It is actually going to be one of the heaviest Colossal Swords with like the highest strength requirements at 50. So it's really only something that you can use a bit later into the game, and even then there are other Colossal Swords out there that can just out-damage this one. But it does have a couple of benefits. One is its charged heavy attack. It does do this little bit of an an AoE explosion. That just results in a bit more damage and a bit more stance damage. Not the most amazing thing, but it's definitely a benefit. But obviously its weapon skill and waves of destruction is what makes this weapon amazing, because it fires out this massive projectile attack with a really wide hitbox that goes ridiculously far, does amazing damage, and only for 25 FP. Now this projectile attack is kind of comparable to the Blasphemous Blade, and the Blasphemous Blade kind of just did like directly outclass it as like a similar type of skill. But ever since the DLC releasing, they actually nerfed the Blasphemous Blade stance damage and its knockback potential, which inherently made the Ruin's Greatsword just more useful. And also it is pretty much going to be like a pure physical damaging projectile attack too. So it can be an amazing weapon, but I think the only downside is going to be its range and its weight. Number 15, the Dragon Greatsword from Dark Souls 1. Now this weapon I could have easily put into the top 5 if it was just a bit more consistent, because yeah, this thing can be broken. Now this is the heaviest Ultra Greatsword in the entire game, does have the highest requirements too. And being that it is a dragon based weapon, just having it equipped does give you a boost to your fire and magic damage negation. And just like most dragon weapons, it gets really high base damage. Now unfortunately, it gets no scalings, which is not really the worst thing sometimes, because with weapons that get no scalings and really high base damage, they tend to be really good at early game, or if you're going to be going with a build that just focuses on leveling up your health and your stamina. But the thing is, it has a 50 strength requirement, and it's really heavy. So you're going to be speccing into a lot of stats just to be able to use this thing. And if you have 50 strength, you're going to get more damage with some of the other Ultra Greatswords. But the main reason why this thing actually gets as high as it does is its heavy attack. It actually does result in a nice downward slam heavy that actually can shoot at a projectile attack too. Now, just like all projectile heavy attacks in Dark Souls 1, they're going to consume a lot of durability. Now, thankfully, this weapon actually does have really high durability, but this heavy attack can just be broken. Like, look at the damage of this thing. It is just absurd. If you use it at point blank range, you will hit with both the weapon and the projectile, and it just melts everything. Now, the only thing that stopped me from putting it a lot higher on the list is that it's so inconsistent. There are so many times that I just missed with the projectile and hit with the weapon, and it's ended up doing so much less damage. I had like literally a less than 50% success rate with actually landing this particular attack. If the tracking was a bit better and the hitboxes were a bit more consistent, I would easily put it a lot higher, because it's so broken in terms of damage. But yeah, unfortunately, there's few too many downsides. Number 14, the ZWEIHANDER in Elden Ring. Now, the ZWEIHANDERs tend to be like the lightest of the Ultra Greatswords, but typically get some of the lowest amounts of damage as well. And sometimes, if the game actually likes us, they'll give it to us really early in the game. And in this instance for Elden Ring, it does do that. You're going to have a really light Colossal Sword with really low requirements that you can very well use right at the beginning of the game, and just gain access to Colossal Sword types of damage, stance damage, and their amazing weapon skill options, because part of the reason why the Colossal Swords are so good is because they get so much variation in Ash of War options. Things like Vacuum Slice, Lion's Claw, there are so many broken pairings alongside with this weapon, and alongside getting a really solid moveset, they could be some of the best strength options in the game. Now, specifically for the ZWEIHANDER, it actually does scale a bit better off dexterity, and honestly, it's not just going to be an early game option, but it's also going to be really viable later in the game too, and it's purely because of its heavy attack. It gets a poking heavy attack, which, as I've been mentioning throughout the entire video, and as I always mention, poking attacks are just amazing. They can maximize the reach of a weapon, and they're obviously going to be doing piercing damage or thrusting damage depending on the game, which is like consistently one of the best damage types, as a lot of enemies are weaker to it. And counterattack damage can make these things just hit super hard. And in Elden Ring, where you have buffs like the Spiked Cracked Tier, Axe Talisman, Two-Handed Talisman, having things like Crag Blade or Royal Knight Resolved equipped, you can have your charged heavy attack builds be an absolute machine. Now, the only downside is that it is probably going to get outclassed by the Fire Knight's Greatsword, because that also gets the poking heavy attack, also is pretty light, but it gets the better light attack combo, so I might end up valuing that one a bit more. Number 13, the CRYPT BLACKSWORD from Dark Souls 2. Which is probably one of the best dark weapons, if not the best dark weapon to use in the entire game. And dark base builds are broken because hexes are kind of broken themselves. They can make the entire game very much easy mode. And the CRYPT BLACKSWORD, although tied behind New Game Plus with the power of bonfire aesthetics, not going to be the most difficult task. I think like the most annoying thing about it is going to be its somewhat higher requirements. Might not be the easiest thing to build around. But part of the reason why the CRYPT BLACKSWORD is so good is because of its moveset. It's one of 2 Ultra Greatswords that do share the Great Axe moveset, which I think is just a better version than the Ultra Greatsword moveset, as it does guarantee doing the nice horizontal swipes, but it also does get a really quick downward heavy attack, and it also gets the better running attack too. And the fact that it shares the same moveset as the Great Axes gets the highest poise damage out of all the Ultra Greatswords. King's Ultra Greatsword, which also gets the same moveset. Now, the King's Ultra Greatsword can actually outdamage the CRYPT BLACKSWORD in basically every single infusion except for Dark. So as amazing as the CRYPT BLACKSWORD is, it's still going to be very limited to that Dark build. So that's going to be the main reason why I didn't put it a bit higher. But one other benefit that the CRYPT BLACKSWORD does get is that it retains the same amount of counter damage as all the other Ultra Greatswords, where the King's Ultra Greatsword gets 110. So although it might be a bit outclassed in some areas, it still does enough for it to be this high on the list. Number 12, the Smelter Sword, and I'm also going to talk about the Aged Smelter Sword as well because they're basically the exact same thing. And these are personally my favorite Ultra Great Swords in the entire game because not only do they look really cool, but they're also really fun, especially when power stands. Now both swords get the exact same moveset, same requirements, same weight, same counter damage and poise damage, but the differences being is that the Aged Smelter Sword actually does give you a magic scaling, whereas the regular Smelter Sword gives you a fire scaling, someone scaling off either intelligence or faith, and the Aged Smelter Sword scaling purely off intelligence. Now at higher levels, the Smelter Sword actually can do more damage, but the Aged Smelter Sword does get higher durability, so I'm probably going to value that one more. And that's because of the heavy attack of this weapon does consume a lot of durability, and that's probably going to be the major attack that you are going to be using. Now, it does get that same horizontal moveset as all the other Ultra Great Swords get, and that same poking attack heavy. Now, this poking attack heavy, once again, is a bit slower than things like the ZWEIHANDER poking attack, but in return, you do this nice high damaging AoE on top of the attack. Now, probably still might not perform as well as things like the DRAKEWING Ultra Great Sword in terms of that same moveset and the unique heavy attack, but the main reason why I'm going to put the Smelter Swords higher is because when you have them power stance, they do a unique L2 attack that slams both weapons on the ground, and it just destroys basically everything in the game. Like, yes, it still consumes a lot of durability. It's actually going to consume a lot of stamina, so it's not going to be completely overpowered. Now, based on this one attack alone, it actually is probably deserving to be in the top 10, but being that you actually get this way later into the game, and being that power sensing Ultra Great Swords is going to be very stat hungry, like you need to level up a lot of strength, vitality, while also having to go accounts for your damaging stats. And unfortunately, these weapons cannot be buffed and infused either. So as much as I do love them, they don't do enough for them to be into the top 10. Number 11, the Fire Knight's Greatsword in Elden Ring. Now, as I talked about with the ZWEIHANDER earlier, this weapon is pretty much going to be the replacement for that once you do get to the DLC, because it actually does get that exact same poking attack heavy, also can be infused, also is pretty light, but it just gets the really good light attack combo on top of it, because this light attack combo just is a bit faster. And it has better hit detection too. Now, the Fire Knight's Greatsword also does come with some split fire damage. So if you actually did want to go into like a pure physical damaging build, the ZWEIHANDER might end up doing more damage, especially if you are fighting enemies that are resist to fire. If I were going to go into a charged heavy attack build with Cragblade, being that Cragblade only boosts your physical damage, the ZWEIHANDER might be better in that instance too. But this thing with a faith-based build can get some of the highest damage out of all the Colossal swords while also getting the best moveset. So there are so many different ways that you can build around it. Just going into a faith build using things like Flame Spear, you actually can go into a charged heavy attack build with Royal Knight Resolve, and any single one of these builds can just be broken. Number 10, the ASTORA's Greatsword from Dark Souls 3. And this weapon is the reason why the ZWEIHANDER from Dark Souls 3 just did not make it to the list, because typically the ZWEIHANDER is that really light Ultra Greatsword with lower requirements that you can get really early on in the game. But the thing is, the ASTORA's Greatsword can also be acquired early on in the game, is actually lighter than the ZWEIHANDER, gets lower requirements, more range, can do more damage for the exact same moveset. So it's just going to be the better option. Now, the ASTORA's Greatsword does scale better off dexterity than it does strength. Actually gets an S scaling in dexterity with a sharp infusion. Now, compared to the strength-based Greatswords, it's probably not going to hit as hard. But the fact that this actually gets above average damage in terms of an Ultra Greatsword, while only weighing 8 units, while having some of the most range, while also getting the really good moveset, but it also does get a unique skill in charge, which this skill just completely just cheeses almost every single humanoid enemy in the entire game. Because the skill basically results in an infinite stun lock. They're just like never going to be able to get up, because as soon as they stand up, you can just keep going over and over again. So it offers great utility to the weapon. It's not going to be something that you spam all the time, because the charged heavy attacks can actually do more damage and kind of offer you like a similar benefit while consuming less stamina and obviously no FP. But yeah, the ASTORA's Greatsword is like literally one of the best weapons in the game, and you get it very early on, and it's very easy to spec into. Number 9, the Rings Knight paired Greatswords from Dark Souls 3, which this is a paired Ultra Greatsword that does get a very unique light attack combo. That might not be the most forgiving thing for a lot of players because it does have a somewhat longer animation, specifically with the first part. But the Ring Knight paired Greatswords does so many things well, mainly going to be its poise damage. Like, this attack actually gets more poise damage than all of the other Ultra Greatswords. Like, you'll be noticing that you poise break enemies like 2 or 3 attacks faster with this attack than you actually would with other Ultra Greatswords. And just like all paired weapons in Dark Souls 3, that is going to be broken in terms of damage too, because you're hitting with like 2 separate weapons at once. And even if you do account for the really long starting up animation, if you look at the burst DPS, you can actually get very similar DPS to like a sharp infused LOTHRIC Ultra Greatsword. Sometimes even more damage because the initial poking attack actually is doing thrusting damage. And you're actually going to benefit a lot of that thrusting damage because the weapon is mainly doing physical. It does get like 20 or 30 fire damage. Now in terms of its AR, it's not going to really get the highest, but it actually does get scalings in 4 different stats, and you can spec into these 4 stats, and at higher levels, it definitely can get some of the highest AR. And on top of all this, it actually does get a somewhat useful weapon art as well, because it actually does double down into like a projectile attack and like an AoE or like another poking attack that actually can do a bunch more fire damage. I kind of wish the skill actually buffed the weapon with more fire damage too. That would have been pretty cool, because unfortunately the damage of this skill and combined with the shitty tracking as well, there are very few circumstances to where I actually would like to use this thing. But even then, the entire weapon as a whole is just amazing. Number 8's the Ivory King Ultra Greatsword in Dark Souls 2, which is another boss weapon that we're going to be talking about. I don't know why, like in the entire series, like most Ultra Greatswords just have to be boss weapons. Like just in Dark Souls 2 alone, there are 14 Ultra Greatswords, and 9 of them are boss weapons for some reason, which is cool, but it kind of makes them a pain in the ass to upgrade because petrified dragon bones are like really annoying to come by. But for the Ivory King Ultra Greatsword, it is a quality-based weapon that does mainly get physical damage. You do get a little bit of magic damage too. And you do have this weapon two-handed and use its attacks, which this moveset is basically identical to the ZWEIHANDER, but being that it actually does get somewhat of a special moveset, you actually get a little bit of an extended magic attack. It's going to have that slightly bit slower heavy attack, but like this magic effect that it adds onto the weapon for every single attack when you have it two-handed is going to be the reason why it does get into the top 10, because it turns its damage to be like somewhat average to be like one of the best, while also having like the most range as well, because the weapon actually does get that extended bit. Although at these further distances, you're not going to be hitting with the weapon hitbox, so you're not going to be getting as much damage. But the fact that you get the best Ultra Greatsword moveset while just getting ridiculous damage for every single attack, while also not weighing that much and not really consuming much stamina either, is going to easily be one of the best Ultra Greatswords. The only downside is that it does consume a decent amount of durability for every single swing, but being that you do get it later in the game, you can get the +2 bracing knuckle ring, so that is going to be an unfortunate small downside to an otherwise amazing weapon. Number 7 in the Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword in Elden Ring. This is a strength and arcane based colossal sword that actually does get the most range in class, can get some very nice damage, and it does have a ridiculously powerful skill in White Light Charge that does have you go from one side of the room all the way to the other in this nice poking attack, and you get the option of a follow-up AoE that could do amazing damage, send enemies flying to the ground, and you can just completely stun lock these enemies over and over. Now, it is going to have somewhat of a longer animation, so its major use is just going to be from getting from A to B really quickly. And sometimes if you are further away from a boss and you do see an opening, in most cases when you end up getting there, your opening is already gone. But with a weapon like this, you can pretty much maximize almost every opening that you do get, which I think is like the most powerful part about this thing. And being able to move this quickly does make you a very hard target to hit as well. Now, with its long animation, it might not be the best thing to use against bosses that give you shorter openings, but this thing gets a poking heavy attack, so it doesn't even matter. Which I'm just going to mention it again. Poking attacks maximize the range of a weapon, it's going to be really fast, and it's going to be doing piercing damage, which is the best damage type. And with counterattack damage and things like the Spear Talisman, you're melting so many bosses. And with how easy it is to actually build around charged heavy attack builds and how much you benefit of it, I think this weapon is just a complete package. Number 6, the Dark Souls 1 Greatsword or the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword. I was actually really close to putting this one at number 1 in the entire list, because for a split moment, I actually did like this one a bit more than the ZWEIHANDER. Actually, for me personally, I do like it more than the ZWEIHANDER, because both Ultra Greatswords are the only ones in their class to actually get the faster light attack combo. It's not that noticeable, but they both do get the faster version. They're both pretty light with pretty low requirements, albeit the ZWEIHANDER is a bit lighter, but they both get identical damage. Like literally base damage, their scalings are exactly the same. Doesn't matter what stats that you spec into, both these weapons are always going to hit just as hard. Now the major differences being is going to be their heavy attack, because the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword gets a poking heavy attack and the ZWEIHANDER gets a downward slam heavy attack. Now as I've been talking about the entire video, I love to have a poking attack because you're going to have a different damage type and it's typically going to output more damage, and in this game with the Leah ring, you can actually one-shot bosses sometimes with this heavy attack. Now, unfortunately for the Greatsword, it doesn't get as much poise damage, nor actually have a special effect like the ZWEIHANDER heavy attack does, because the ZWEIHANDER heavy attack can actually pancake enemies to the ground every single time, and you can just repeatedly stunlock enemies this way, whereas the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword doesn't really get anything like that. So it's much easier to cheese a lot of different enemies, and it's a lot easier to use the ZWEIHANDER. But one thing that I completely forgot about is that you can just do a jumping attack and gain the exact same effect. A jumping attack goes just as far as a ZWEIHANDER heavy attack, actually can do more damage, and also flatten enemies to the ground. And you can do this with every single Ultra Greatsword. So my thought process was that you actually can flatten enemies with a Greatsword. You're going to get just as much damage and the exact same fast light attack combo, but you're just going to get a higher damaging heavy attack. But one thing that I underestimated was how much poise damage that the ZWEIHANDER heavy attack actually does get, which is what I will get into. That's going to be like the main reason why that one's going to get a bit higher. But yeah, that's basically my overall thoughts. The GODSLAYER'S Greatsword and ZWEIHANDER are like two of the best strength weapons in the entire game. And depending on which one that you kind of prefer, whether it be like really good damage or really good poise damage and stun lock potential, will be dependent on which one that you actually do pick. Number 5, the King's Ultra Greatsword in Dark Souls 2. Now, I consider this to be the best Ultra Greatsword in the entirety of the game, because this thing is not only the hardest hitting one, like pretty much on every single infusion except for Dark, this one just gets the most damage, but it also does get the best moveset too, because it's an Ultra Greatsword with a Great Axe moveset, so it does get those nice horizontal swiping light attacks, it does get that really quick downward slam heavy attack, and it also gets the good downward slam running attack too. Which one of the downsides of the Ultra Greatswords in Dark Souls 2 is that you can't really seamlessly combo in your running attack into a light attack, which is actually a combo in this game that is extremely powerful. And also on top of all this, it gets striking damage. And striking damage is the best damage type in this game because basically everything is weaker to it. And on top of all that, it also gets the most poise damage in class 2. Now, unfortunately, it does only get 110 counter damage compared to the other Ultra Greatswords getting 130. But with Ultra Greatswords, you're not really having many opportunities to where you're getting a counter attack anyway. It also is tied for the heaviest Ultra Greatsword in the game too, with like the highest strength requirements, but you do get it later in the game. And once you do gain access to it, I would honestly use it because this thing is amazing. Number 4, the Dragon Bone Smasher in Demon Souls, which is one of 2 very large swords in this game. This one just being the harder hitting one that does have slightly higher requirements and weigh a bunch more. That's honestly not going to be the worst thing because yeah, this thing hits like an absolute truck. Now the moveset itself is not going to be the most forgiving thing. The light attack combos are extremely slow and consume a lot of stamina. The follow-up light attack might have a bit of weird hit detection as well, but it doesn't change the fact that the damage is just ridiculous. The running attack can send these enemies flying through the air. The heavy attack combo is actually pretty decent as well. And with how high the damage actually can be, on top of all that, you actually can buff it as well. Like the only downside that I can say about it is that it is a boss weapon and it has to upgrade with colorless demon souls, which is a pain in the ass sometimes. But yeah, this thing is an absolute menace. Number 3, the LOTHRIC Knight's Greatsword in Dark Souls 3, which I consider to be the best Ultra Greatsword in this game. Now, as I've been talking about a lot of the Dark Souls 3 Ultra Greatswords, they all perform very similar. They all get very similar movesets, but they might slightly differ in terms of damage type, slightly different skill, slightly different requirements. But when it comes to like a mixture of all those things, I think the LOTHRIC Knight Greatsword just comes out on top because it does get the best light attack combo in my opinion with those nice horizontal swipes. And it also gets the poking attack heavy, which is all that I really want in a Dark Souls 3 Ultra Greatsword. And the LOTHRIC Knight Greatsword can actually be one of the hardest hitting ones with this poking attack heavy. Funnily enough, it actually does scale better off dexterity like most things in this game. Now this thing actually does come with some split lightning damage, but still can be buffed and infused. So you might be somewhat limited in actually going into things like lightning damaging buffs. But thankfully, lightning damage is the best elemental damage type in this game. Not many things that resist to it, and there are a lot that are weak. And it does come with the Stomp Upward Cut skill, which I haven't really talked about Stomp as much because there aren't many circumstances to where I do find it that useful. It does give you a lot of hyper armor. So if you are like in a situation to where like enemies are stun locking you, you could just use this really quickly. It is also pretty good at breaking shields, and it can send enemies flying into the air. And being that it actually does do somewhat of a vertical swing, it might be good at hitting some enemies that are a bit higher up. So it does complement the weapon pretty nicely. But yeah, the fact that this thing doesn't really weigh that much, doesn't have that high of a requirement, you can get it early on in the game, and you just gain access to one of the hardest hitting attacks in this charged heavy poke. I think all those things make this one be the best Ultra Greatsword in Dark Souls 3, and one of the best weapons in the game. Number 2, the Elden Ring Greatsword. The GODSLAYER'S Greatswords are pretty good in every single game, some better than others, but yeah, this one definitely stands alone as the best one, as it basically covers everything that you wanted to. You get it very early on in the game, it gets the most range out of all the infusible Colossal Swords, and it gets the most damage out of all the Colossal Swords as well. Like the only actual downside that I could say about it is that it doesn't get the poking heavy attack, so you kind of lose out on a bit there. But the thing is, in this game, with the infusible weapons, you have the option to equip certain skills onto them. So if you really want to actually have a poking attack, you can go ahead and equip something like Giant Hunt, which is like one of the best skills in the entire game. And with the GODSLAYER'S Greatsword, it's probably the best pairing because it can do ridiculous damage, do amazing stance damage, have a quick animation, only consume 16 FP. But probably even better than that would be its pairing with things like Lion's Claw, which Lion's Claw is probably not going to hit as hard as Giant Hunt. Probably not have as quick as an animation, and Lion's Claw is more expensive too. But Lion's Claw, when it comes to the ease of use, it is just second to none. You get infinite hyper armor from the second that you click the button, so you're like never gonna get staggered out of it. You can continuously flatten enemies to the ground over and over again. It lunges really far, and with the damage and the range of the Guts' Greatsword, you can put Lion's Claw in like a Colossal weapon and probably benefits more in terms of damage and stance damage. But Colossal Swords get a much better and more manageable moveset in my opinion, because they get these nice wide horizontal swipes that are honestly not that slow. And you also do benefit of the crouching and rolling poking attack, which I honestly haven't mentioned at all this entire video. But yeah, this attack itself is also really good. So yeah, the Guts' Greatsword is one of the best strength weapons in the game and definitely the best Colossal Sword. And still, the best Ultra Greatsword, the ZWEIHANDER in Dark Souls 1. It was getting pretty close. For a second, I actually wanted to put the Guts' Greatsword from Dark Souls 1 at number 1. But as I talked about with the Guts' Greatsword, even though that one actually does get the higher damaging heavy attack and also the quicker light attack combos while getting the exact same AR values and very similar weight and requirements, the stun lock potential, the ease of use, and the poise damage is what makes the ZWEIHANDER just be the better option in my opinion, and not to include the fact that you get it right at the beginning of the game. And it's to the point that it can even outdamage some other Ultra Great Swords too, while being the lightest with the lowest requirements. Don't know how that worked out, because this alongside the Guts' Greatsword gets that faster light attack combo. Now yes, the jumping attack can flatten enemies to the ground just as well as the heavy attack can, which I talked about a bit earlier, but the heavy attack does more poise damage than the jumping attack, and it can make so many enemies just a complete and utter joke. Like, let me go down the list of enemies and bosses that get staggered by one attack of the ZWEIHANDER that otherwise wouldn't get staggered by things like the Guts' Greatsword. Both Ornstein and Smo get staggered in one hit, the Black Knights, Gwyn, the Giants and Anor Londo, the Gargoyles, the Titanite Demon only takes one heavy attack and one light attack, the Capra Demon, the Taurus Demon. Like, there are so many enemies that just get staggered with every single hit of the ZWEIHANDER that it just makes it hard for me not to put it at number 1. And you get it right at the beginning of the game. Like, how did this happen? I want to talk about the FUME Ultra Greatsword, because I can already tell what the comment section is going to be like, and it's going to be about why the FUME Ultra Greatsword is not going to make it onto the list. And that is true for both the Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 variants. I think that the FUME Ultra Greatsword in both games are probably the most overrated weapons in the entire series. To start off with the Dark Souls 2 variant, which I think is aggressively mediocre, it gets the worst moveset because it has nothing but vertical swipes, and vertical attacks get horrible tracking, and the horizontal swipes are just much better to have. Don't know why it also didn't get a unique L2 that gets some cool fire AoE like what the Fume Knight gets. It also gets the worst counter damage out of all the Ultra Greatswords, and it's not only just an Ultra Greatsword, but it's also the heaviest Ultra Greatsword with the highest requirements, which is another thing. It has a 30 dexterity requirement for some reason and gets a descaling in dexterity. And even if you meet the requirements and have high amounts of strength, it's still not even the hardest hitting Ultra Greatsword. Things like the King's Ultra Greatsword can get more damage, and that one also gets striking damage, which is another thing. Don't know why this thing didn't get striking damage at least, but the fact that it does have such a high dexterity requirement makes it really annoying to try and power stance, and it just makes your damage potential just terrible, because you can take those 30 points you put into dexterity and put them into strength instead, and so many other Ultra Greatswords are just gonna outdamage it. Like, I get it, the weapon looks cool, you get it off a cool boss, that's fantastic, but optimally speaking, you can't be the heaviest Ultra Greatsword in the game while also getting some of the worst stats and nowhere even close to the most amount of damage. Now, as for the Dark Souls 3 Fugs, it's not going to be as bad in my opinion. It was once upon a time like the best weapon in the entire game until it got nerfed really hard, like a couple of months after the game got released. Now it still gets the same vertical movesets, which I don't despise as much in Dark Souls 3, but I'd much rather have the horizontal swipe. It does have really good blocking, which is basically the only positive thing I can say about the Fugs. But the point still stands in that it's the heaviest Ultra Greatsword in the game, has the highest requirements, and still doesn't even get anywhere near as much damage as some of the other Ultra Greatswords. Now thankfully this thing actually does do pure striking damage, which is just better to have than standard damage. Now unfortunately it also extends to the poking attack heavy, which I think is the best heavy attack to have, and it's mainly because you're doing thrusting damage, but with the Fugs it's going to be doing striking damage. So if you like these weapons because they look cool, go ahead and continue to use them, but in my opinion these things are very mid. We are finally done. That was probably the longest Soulsborne ranking video I've had, so definitely please do like and subscribe, and also comment down below if you have any opinions that you'd like to share. In terms of the next video, I am not too sure. I actually am in the middle of doing a fashion contest on stream, so maybe the next video might be a highlight of that fashion contest. But yeah, I'll catch you guys around. Bye.